She was 23 years old, and her last $17 were folded into the front pocket of jeans she'd worn for 4 days straight. The smell of her own exhaustion had become something she no longer noticed, a particular staleness that lived in the collar of her jacket, something between old smoke and dried sweat, and the chemical nothing of bus upholstery. For $1, she had purchased a derelict glassblower's studio in a hollow outside Morgantown, West Virginia, a sagging structure of brick and rusted steel with a collapsed ventilation stack, a shattered clerestory window running the entire south wall, a furnace pit cracked down its center seam, and a concrete floor so stained with flux and silica it looked like a landscape seen from above. The deed was real, the key was real. What nobody knew, what had not been opened or disturbed in 31 years, was what the previous glassblower had sealed inside the furnace's bricked-over secondary chamber. When she finally got it open, it changed the direction of everything. If you've ever been drawn to stories about people who start with almost nothing and build something that lasts, people who find what was waiting for them in the most unexpected places, this channel exists for you. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and leave your location in the comments below. These stories travel farther than I ever expect, and I want to know where in the world you're watching from. Her name was Della Crane, and the knowledge in her hands came from her grandfather. Elliot Crane had spent 40 years as a gaffer at the Blenco Glass Factory in Milton, West Virginia, which meant he had spent 40 years standing at the mouth of furnaces hot enough to blister paint at 10 feet, gathering molten glass on the end of a blowpipe, the way other men gathered breath naturally, without having to think about it. His hands were the colour of old saddle leather, and the knuckles had been heat-mapped into permanent ridges. He could read a gather of glass the way a baker reads dough, by its pull, its hang, its reluctance or willingness. Too cold, and it would stiffen mid-blow and shatter on the pipe. Too hot, and it would droop and lose its form entirely. The temperature that mattered lived in a window of about 40 degrees, and Elliot could find that window by the colour alone, not orange, not yellow, but a specific amber white that most people would describe simply as bright. Elliot saw something finer in it. He called it the listening colour. When glass glowed that way, it was ready to become something. He started teaching Della when she was 6. Not formally, there was no curriculum, no schedule. She simply followed him the way children follow people they love, and he let her close enough to watch. She learnt to gather by gathering. She learnt to blow by blowing. By the time she was 9, she could produce a serviceable cylinder. By 12, she could pull a piece into an elongated form and control the wall thickness through the rotation of the pipe alone. By 15, she understood heat as a language, what the glass was telling you at each stage, what it needed, what would happen if you pushed it past what it was offering. Elliot never praised her directly. He would watch her work, and when she did something right, he would say, "There it is, 2 words." She learned to work for those 2 words the way other children work for gold stars or applause. He died of a cardiac arrest in the factory parking lot on a Tuesday in November, when Della was 19. The factory called her because her number was the one in his wallet. She drove to Milton in his truck and identified him in the back of an ambulance that was not going anywhere. The cause of death was listed as hypertensive heart disease, which was the clinical way of saying that his heart had worked harder than any heart should for longer than any doctor would have recommended. He was 71. He had planned to retire at 72. What changed immediately was everything practical. The truck was his. The house was his, a rented place that had been in his name, and the landlord was not unkind, but was also clear that the lease would not transfer to a 19-year-old with no income. She had 4 weeks. She spent one of them arranging the burial, which took almost all of her savings. She spent the other 3 working as much as anyone would give her days at a hardware counter, evenings cleaning the floor at a restaurant. She was not looking for sympathy. She was looking for enough time to figure out the next thing. The next thing arrived in the form of a woman named Cecile Mounts, who ran a small foundry operation outside Huntington that worked primarily in bronze casting architectural ornaments, replacement hardware for historic restoration projects, occasional commemorative pieces for county courthouses and veterans organizations. Cecile was 62 and had been working metal since before Della was born. She had known Elliot Crane not well, but through the particular network of people who work with heat and transformation and who recognize each other across different trades. She had heard, through someone at the Blenco factory, that Elliot's granddaughter was competent and looking for work. Cecile did not offer charity. She offered a job as a foundry assistant at an hourly rate that was fair and not $1 more. The work was physically demanding in ways that were different from glasswork, but not entirely foreign. The management of heat, the reading of metals behavior, the understanding of how materials move through states of form. What Cecile added to what Elliot had given her was knowledge of patination, the chemical process of aging and treating metal surfaces to achieve specific colors and textures. She taught Della to work with ferric nitrate, liver of sulfur, cupric nitrate, the precise compounds, and their reactions with different alloys. Della learned which temperatures fixed a patina permanently and which would cause it to reverse. She learned to read the surface of a cooled bronze piece the way she had learned to read the surface of cooling glass, as a record of what the material had been through and what it was now. She worked for Cecile for 3 years. She lived in a rented room that was small but sufficient. She saved carefully. She was not unhappy. She was waiting, though she could not have told you what she was waiting for. The expulsion, when it came from Cecile's son. Cecile had a stroke in March, not fatal, but significant enough that she could no longer run the foundry. Her son, whose name was Gerald, and who had spent the past 20 years in commercial real estate in Columbus, arrived to settle the operation. He was not cruel. He was frightened, a man facing his mother's mortality, and a property he didn't understand and financial obligations he was only beginning to calculate. He came to Della directly, which she respected, and he told her plainly that he was closing the foundry within 60 days, and that he was sorry, but there was no other path he could see. She packed what was hers into a bag that had been Elliot's, a canvas duffel with a broken zipper she'd replaced herself with a brass one from Cecile's spare hardware bin. She left the key to the foundry on the workbench. She did not leave a note because there was nothing to say that wasn't already understood. She did not cry. She had learned, after Elliot, that grief was something she processed in motion. Standing still with it was worse. She took a Greyhound southeast from Huntington. She had no destination fixed. She had $411 and her tools in a separate bag, the blowpipe she'd used since she was 12, a set of jacks and shears Cecile had given her, the cherry-handled Marva paddle Elliot had made himself from a piece of reclaimed steel. The bus moved through river valleys and then into the fold of hills that characterized the central part of the state, the hollows deep and shadow-held, even at midday, the trees still carrying the last of November's stripped quality, grey-brown and honest. The landscape felt familiar and foreign simultaneously, which was accurate. This was the land she had grown up near, but she was moving through it now as someone who did not know where she was going to sleep. She got off in a town called Ashford because the bus made a stop, and a man at the station, noticing her bags and her unhurried stillness, mentioned that the county had recently updated its tax forfeiture listings online and that there were a few properties nobody had touched in years. He said it the way people in small towns pass along information, without urgency, as a fact that might or might not be useful. She found a library with public computers 2 blocks from the station, sat down and opened the Marion County tax records. The listing was minimal. Former commercial property, zoned light industrial, 0.4 acres, no assessed improvements value. Listed price, $1 plus back taxes of $212. Total cost to her, $213. She would have $198 left. She looked at the address. She looked at the satellite image. She could see a rectangular brick building, a rusted ventilation stack, what appeared to be a collapsed lean-to on the north side. She sat with it for a moment. Then she closed the browser and walked to the county assessor's office before it closed. The woman behind the counter had been handling property transfers for Marion County for 27 years. Her name was Phyllis Bowen, and she wore reading glasses on a chain that appeared to be made of old watch parts. She looked at Della across the counter with the particular assessment of someone who has seen many people make questionable decisions involving cheap land. "You're aware it was a glass shop," Phyllis said. It was not quite a question. "I'm a glass worker," Della said. Phyllis looked at her for a moment. "The furnace hasn't been fired in over 30 years. The main chamber's cracked." I know what a cracked furnace looks like. Phyllis pulled the file. She walked Della through the paperwork, the quitclaim deed, the back tax agreement, the release of county liability. Della signed where she was told to sign. The process took 40 minutes. At the end of it, Phyllis pressed a stamp onto the deed with the particular authority of someone who has been pressing stamps for a long time, and then she opened a small envelope and placed a key on the counter between them. It was iron, old enough that the surface had gone to a fine grey-brown scale, and it was heavier than it looked, the kind of weight that meant the metal was thick and honest, not decorative. Della picked it up and closed her fingers around it. Henry Voss worked that place for 34 years, Phyllis said, sliding the folder closed. Made some of the finest decorative glass in the county. Closed up one day in 1993, and nobody saw him after. She paused. People tried to buy it twice. Neither one lasted a winter. Della put the key in her jacket pocket. Thank you, Phyllis. Phyllis looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite a smile and not quite worry. You've got the right kind of hands for it, she said quietly. I'll give you that. The studio sat at the end of a gravel track that had returned mostly to grass, identifiable mainly by the two shallow ruts that curved away from the county road and into the tree line. Della walked it, carrying both bags, the November afternoon light coming at a low angle through the hickories, hitting the brick face of the building in a way that made the old mortar joints cast thin shadows. The building was larger than it had appeared in the satellite image, maybe 40 feet long, built low to the ground with a clerestory running the south wall, most of its glass panels gone or cracked, the steel frames holding only the memory of what had been there. A ventilation stack rose from the roof's center point and had pulled away from the flashing at its base, leaning maybe 5 degrees from vertical. The north lean-to had indeed collapsed, its corrugated roof sheeting folded down like something tired of standing. She stood outside for a full 2 minutes before she touched the door. When she turned the iron key and pushed the door open, the smell arrived before anything else. It was specific and composite, silica dust, which has its own mineral blankness, the faint petroleum note of old flux compounds, something organic and faintly sweet that was the accumulated presence of heat, not current heat, but old heat. Decades of firing embedded in the brick and the mortar, and the very air of the structure, which had been sealed long enough to develop its own atmosphere. Under all of it was something else she could not immediately name. It took her a moment. Cedar. Somewhere in the building there was old cedar, and the oil in it had outlasted 30 years of closure. She walked through methodically. The main working area was intact in its bones, the glory hole positioned against the north wall, the annealing oven, its door glass opaque with a thick mineral film sitting against the east wall, the Marva table still in place, its steel surface pitted but level. Tools remained in the racks her grandfather would have recognized, punties and blowpipes of 3 different gauges, a set of paddles that had warped at the handles from years of heat cycling. The floor was poured concrete, thick, original to the building, and it carried in its surface the evidence of its working life. Dark staining in a broad arc around the glory hole where spilled gather had landed over decades, the ghost of footpaths worn fractionally lower between the key stations. A series of small circular marks near the Marva table where a cooling stand had sat for so long it had left its impression in the concrete like a signature. The furnace pit dominated the centre of the room. It was a double-chamber design, the main working chamber above, where the gather pot sat in the heat, and a secondary chamber below and behind, accessible through a low-arched opening at the furnace's rear. Della crouched and looked at the main chamber first. The crack ran diagonally across the rear wall of the firebox, significant but not catastrophic, repairable with the right refractory mortar, the kind of job that would take 2 days and the right temperature cycling to cure properly. She had seen worse. She stood and walked around to the rear of the furnace, to look at the secondary chamber, access the low arch, through which the fireman would have added fuel in an older configuration, or which, in a converted gas furnace, would simply have served as a clean-out and inspection port. The arch was there, but it had been sealed. Not bricked over hastily, this had been done carefully, with matching brick and competent mortar work, finished flush so that at a casual glance it appeared to simply be part of the furnace's rear face. The mortar was a slightly different colour than the surrounding courses, and the joint lines, if you looked at them with the attention, Elliot had spent years teaching her to apply the kind of attention that asked, not just what does this look like, but how was this made? The joint lines were too regular, too deliberate. This had been closed by someone who knew what they were doing and intended it to stay closed. She looked at it for a long time. She found a cold chisel in the tool rack and a short sledge hanging from a wall peg. She worked carefully, starting at the mortar joints rather than the brick faces, chipping away the seal with measured strokes. The mortar was old enough to be brittle, but dense it came away in pieces, chalking to dust at the edges. She worked for 40 minutes. When the last brick pulled free, the sound the space made was the sound of pressure equalizing across 3 decades. A low, dry exhalation, as if the chamber had been holding its breath. She pointed her phone's flashlight into the opening. She sat back on her heels. She did not move for a moment. The chamber was roughly 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide. It was dry. The furnace's own thermal mass had protected it from moisture infiltration, even through 30 years of freeze and thaw. On the floor of the chamber sat a wooden trunk, cedar, which explained the smell. Beside it, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with wire, was a flat bundle. And on top of the trunk, resting against the chamber wall, was a glass object, a vase, deep cobalt, maybe 14 inches tall, with a pulled neck and a rim that flared open like a morning glory. In the beam of the flashlight, it was flawless. It had been made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She reached in and brought the vase out first. She held it up and turned it slowly. The glass was Elliot's listening colour, that amber white of readiness frozen now into blue, permanent and still. She set it carefully on the marva table. The oilcloth bundle contained documents, logbooks, 9 of them, running from 1959 to 1993, filled in a compact, careful hand that recorded every piece produced in this studio, the date, the gather weight, the temperature, the technique, the destination, the price received. Beside the logbooks were 3 ledgers of accounts receivable. Beside those, a packet of photographs, black and white and later colour, showing finished pieces and the man who had made them, stocky, pale-eyed, standing at his furnace with the particular ease of someone completely at home. Beneath the logbooks were envelopes, 14 of them, sealed and bundled with a rubber band that had long since lost its tension and sat slack around the packet. She did not open them yet. At the bottom of the trunk were the bills. She counted them twice. They were large denominations, 50s and 100s, primarily some 20s old series, still legal tender. There were also 4 money orders from a Clarksburg bank, made out to no specific payee, dated $1,993, each for $500. The total, when she had finished counting and sat with the number, $22,400. She sat on the concrete floor with the money in her lap, and the logbooks open beside her, and the cobalt vase on the marva table catching the last light coming through the ruined clerestory, and she understood that she had been left something. Not found something, left something. She opened the largest envelope last. The letter inside was written on the studio's own letterhead, Henry Voss Glass, Ashford, W.V., in the same compact hand as the logbooks. It was dated the 14th of October, 1993. To whoever opens this chamber, my name is Henry Voss. I worked in this building for 34 years. I came here when I was 26 with 1 furnace design. I'd worked out on paper and enough money to build the shell. I leave today at 60, and I am leaving because my hands are done, not injured, finished. The nerves that read the heat have been reading it for so long, they have stopped sending the information clearly. I could keep going and make work that is acceptable. I cannot make work that is true. There is a difference, and I refuse to confuse them. I saved this money over 20 years from pieces I sold privately, work that never went through the accounts. I am leaving it here rather than taking it because I do not need it where I am going, and because this building should belong to someone who will understand what it is. A bank would own it, a developer would erase it. Whoever finds this will have earned it by finding it, and finding it means they came here with the right kind of attention. The main furnace chamber needs the rear wall repointed with a refractory compound rated above 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Do not use standard masonry mix. It will fail before you reach working temperature. There is a limestone spring 40 yards due north of the building, behind the large sycamore. The water from it is cold and clean, and close enough to run a pipe if you need cooling capacity. One more thing. The cobalt vase on top of the trunk was the last piece I made here. It is the best thing I ever made. It belongs to this room. Please don't sell it. I believe in the person reading this. I don't know who you are, but I know this building has been waiting, and it seems to me that buildings and people find each other when the time is right. Henry Voss, the 14th of October, 1993. She read the letter once, then she read it again. The third time, she read it aloud, alone in the building, to the cold room and the last light and whoever might have been listening. When she finished, she looked at the cobalt vase on the marva table. She said, "I won't." 2 sentences, to no one and to everyone, in the old language of promises made in empty rooms. If you're still here, thank you for sitting with this story. I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where you realized the hardest thing that happened to you was actually pointing you somewhere? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. She took the money orders to a bank in Clarksburg the following week. The clerk, a young man named Tobias, who couldn't have been more than 25, looked at the dates on the money orders, and then looked at Della, and then looked at the money orders again. He called his manager. The manager called the bank's legal department. It took 4 days and 2 signed affidavits, but the instruments were valid, never cashed, never stopped, legally the property of whoever held them. The cash she deposited separately, in full, declaring it as found property to the county assessor per the relevant statute. The assessor, who turned out to be Phyllis Bowen's nephew, returned it to her 3 weeks later with a letter confirming clear title. She opened a business account. She made a list. The furnace repair came first. She sourced Castellite, 3-0 refractory, castable from a supplier in Pittsburgh, the right compound, the one Henry Voss had not named but had pointed her toward with enough precision that she knew what she was looking for. She packed the cracked rear wall in layers, curing each one carefully, bringing the temperature up in stages over 3 days. The first firing, when it finally reached working temperature without cracking, was the moment she allowed herself to believe the place was hers. The clerestory panels she replaced herself, fabricating the frames from steel bar stock using skills Cecile had given her the welding and fitting that her glasswork background alone would not have covered. The glass she salvaged from a demolished greenhouse in Buckhannon whose owner was glad to have someone haul it away. It was not period-correct glass, but it let in light, and light was the point. The first person to arrive while she was working was an old man named Rupert, who came down the gravel track one afternoon in January, carrying a paper bag. He had been Henry Voss's propane supplier for 16 years. He didn't say much. He set the bag on the marva table. It contained a jar of pickled beans from his wife's garden and a new set of graphite pads for the blowpipe. And he looked at the furnace and looked at the repointed rear wall and said, "Henry always said someone would come back to this." He left before she could offer him anything. A woman named Dorothea came in February. She had purchased 3 pieces from Henry in 1987 and had driven past the studio every week since it closed, on her way to visit her sister. She brought a box of Henry's pieces she had bought over the years, offering to loan them to the studio as a reference collection. She stayed for an hour and told Della about Henry's technique, his preference for a particular cobalt batch he'd sourced from a supplier in Ohio, his habit of working in near silence, his insistence that each piece be inspected by morning light before it was sold. He said artificial light lies, Dorothea told her. Morning light tells the truth. A retired millwright named Calvin arrived in March with a replacement burner assembly he'd machined himself from a description Della had posted in a local trade forum. He'd known Henry slightly. They had both attended the same volunteer fire company for a decade. He installed the burner in 2 hours, refused payment, and accepted coffee. Before he left, he looked at the cobalt vase on the marva table, where Della had placed it as soon as the studio was functional. He brought that to a fire company dinner once. Calvin said, held it up to the light and told us all to look at what colour can do when it's got somewhere to go. He paused. Seems like it found where it was going. In April, the spring revealed itself exactly where Henry's letter had said it would be, 40 yards north behind the large sycamore, cold and clear and present as a fact. She was outside at the end of a May evening, sitting on the low stone wall that ran along the east side of the property, the same wall she had realised when she repointed its mortar in late March. that Henry Voss had built himself, course by course, from limestone pulled out of the same field. The light was the specific gold of late May in the hill country, laying itself along the top of the ridgeline to the west and fading into something cooler and bluer as it came down toward the hollow. The sycamore by the spring was in full leaf, its white upper branches visible above the tree line like pale hands. She thought about Henry Voss, not sentimentally specifically. She thought about what it would cost a person to love a place the way he had loved this one for 34 years, to know every crack in its floor and the particular sound its ventilation made in a north wind, and then to understand that your hands had given everything they had and to leave it anyway, not in despair, but with enough care to brick up a chamber and leave instructions and a letter addressed to no one in particular and faith in a future person you would never meet. That was not resignation. That was a particular form of love that most people never have the occasion to practice. She thought about Elliot. She thought about the word he'd used, the listening colour. She had used it 100 times since the first firing, standing at her furnace with a gather at the end of the pipe, watching for that specific amber white that said the glass was ready. What he had given her was not technique. Technique was the part you could learn from anyone. What he had given her was a vocabulary for paying attention, a way of looking at the world that asked not just what something appeared to be, but what it was telling you, what it needed, what it was becoming. That vocabulary had brought her here. It had read the mortar joints on the back of the furnace. It had understood the weight of an iron key. Without it, she would have walked through this studio and seen a derelict building. Because of it, she had seen what was waiting. She thought about Gerald. She found that she could hold him without bitterness, which had not always been true. He had been a frightened man doing the only thing he knew how to do with his fear, which was to convert it into action and close what he didn't understand. She was not grateful to him, but she could see, with the distance of a year and the evidence of what the road had delivered, that his closed door had been the only door she would have walked through that led here. You cannot plan your way to a hollow in the West Virginia hills in November with a rusted iron key in your pocket. You can only be pushed far enough off the road you expected to travel that you find yourself on the one that was actually yours. For anyone who has ever had a door close on them without warning anyone, who has packed a bag that was already someone else's and stood on the wrong side of a locked gate and tried to figure out what comes next. The money in the wall is real, but it is not the story. The story is that the places which need us and the people who can hear them are always looking for each other, and that the push you didn't ask for and the road you didn't choose and the building nobody wanted are sometimes the same sentence, spoken slowly, by something that has been patient enough to wait for the right person to arrive. What you thought was your worst moment was the address. What you found was not luck. It was correspondence, the world sending a letter to the only person who knew how to read it. Picture it, a cobalt vase on a steel table in the morning light, and a woman standing before her fired furnace in a hollow in the hills, holding a blowpipe that belonged to her grandfather, watching the glass in the gather glow amber white, and knowing without needing to say it, without needing anyone to confirm it, that she is exactly where she is supposed to be. At 23 years old, broke and carrying everything she owned in 2 bags, Della Crane spent $1.212 in back taxes on a derelict Glassblower studio no one else wanted. It was the best dollar she ever spent. If you know someone who is standing at the end of a road they didn't choose, looking at a door that just closed behind them, share this story with them, not as comfort, as evidence. And I'll leave you with this question for the comments. What is the thing you almost didn't do, the door you almost didn't open, that turned out to be the one that mattered? I'll read every answer. There are more stories like this one waiting on this channel, stories about people who listened carefully to places that needed to be heard. I'll see you in the next one.